Hey guys, tonight we step into the streets of South Boston, a place where loyalty isn't a slogan, it's a survival skill. Where the skyline might be small, but the shadows stretch long over secrets whispered in corner bars and deals sealed with nothing more than a glance. We're talking about James Whitey Bulger, the man who played both sides of the law and made the city his chessboard. Picture this. It's the late 1970s. The hum of the harbor mixes with the clink of beer glasses, and in the back rooms of Southie, conversations are happening that will never make the papers. The underworld is shifting, and in the middle of it all, Whitey sits calm, eyes sharp, smile faint. He's not just surviving Boston's storm, he's learning how to steer it. He's not a brute. He's a strategist. And with a mix of charm, calculation, and ruthless timing, he built a network that reached from the neighborhood streets to the highest offices. To some, he was a protector. To others, a ghost you didn't dare cross. Either way, his presence shaped the city. If you're into stories where power hides in plain sight, where alliances are made over coffee as much as they are in shadows, and where the line between good and bad is thin enough to vanish, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe for more legends of the underworld, and drop in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because tonight, we pour one for the man who blurred the lines, outlasted the game, and left Boston with a story it will never forget. Whitey Bulger was born James Joseph Bulger Jr. in 1929 in the gritty, close-knit neighborhood of South Boston. People called it Southie, and for those who grew up there, it was more than just a location. It was a badge of identity. Southie had its own unwritten rules, its own rhythms. Families looked out for one another, and loyalty mattered as much as breathing. It was also a place where toughness was a form of currency, and young Whitey quickly understood the exchange rate. From a young age, he stood out among the local kids, not just for his pale blonde hair, which earned him the nickname Whitey, but for his restless energy. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made people step aside when he walked down the street. He was smart, sharper than most realized, and always watching. Even then, he seemed to understand people, what drove them, what they feared, what they wanted. His family was respectable, his parents hard-working, but Whitey was drawn to adventure in all its forms. In the Southie of the 1930s and 40s, adventure sometimes meant finding your way into small-time trouble. Whitey was known to roam the streets long after other kids had gone home, slipping into pool halls, hanging out near the docks, talking to older boys who had already started skirting the law. These weren't hardened criminals, but they had a rebellious streak, and Whitey admired their boldness. At school he was bright but restless. He had little patience for authority figures who didn't command his respect. Teachers sometimes complained about his defiance, but others noted his ability to lead. He wasn't loud or brash about it. People just seemed to follow him. If a group of kids needed someone to decide where they were going or what they'd do next, Whitey was the one they looked to. As he grew older, the city around him was changing. Boston was still recovering from the Great Depression, jobs were scarce, and tensions between neighborhoods could run high. Opportunities for advancement were limited, especially for Irish-American families in working-class districts. Whitey began to see that in certain circles, quick thinking and street savvy could open doors that traditional paths kept firmly shut. By the late 1940s, he had already tested those doors more than once. He'd developed a taste for risk, not recklessness, but calculated chances. He'd watch people, situations, and patterns, weighing his options before making a move. This habit of careful observation would stay with him for life, shaping decisions that later made him both a feared and respected figure in Boston. Whitey wasn't the kind to talk much about dreams or plans, but those close to him could sense that he was aiming for more than just scraping by. He wanted influence, not for show, but because influence gave a person freedom. In Southie, the men who had influence weren't necessarily the richest. They were the ones whose words carried weight, whose presence made others pause before speaking. Whitey saw that and decided, in his own quiet way, that he would be one of them. Still, in these early years, He was just a young man with sharp instincts and a hunger for something bigger. He hadn't yet built the connections or the reputation that would eventually make him a legend in Boston's underworld. But the foundation was there. The watchfulness, the ambition, and the unshakable belief that he could outthink and outmaneuver almost anyone. Southie itself was his first classroom. The streets taught him lessons about loyalty, about how respect could be given and taken away, about how power often came from the perception of strength rather than its actual use. And as Whitey walked those streets, day after day, he was quietly preparing himself for the day when he'd stop watching and start leading. In the years following his restless youth, Whitey Bulger began to carve out a path for himself that was very different from the steady, quiet lives of most of his neighbors. South Boston remained his home base, but his gaze stretched beyond its narrow streets. He was no longer just the quick-footed boy with the pale blonde hair. He was becoming a young man who understood how to navigate both opportunity and risk. The late 1940s and early 1950s were times of change. Boston was expanding, new developments were sprouting in different parts of the city, and the post-war years brought both optimism and new tensions. In working-class neighborhoods like Southie, some people tried to climb the social ladder through education or steady work. Others, however, sought a different kind of advancement, one that didn't depend on the approval of bosses or the unpredictability of the job market. Whitey seemed drawn to that second path, though he never broadcast his intentions. He spent a lot of time observing people who were older and more experienced. He paid attention to how certain men carried themselves in the neighborhood. Men who didn't have to raise their voices to command respect. Men who could settle disputes with a few quiet words. They weren't politicians, but they had political influence. They weren't police, but they had a kind of authority that even law enforcement recognized. Whitey studied their methods, their interactions, the way they built networks of loyalty and trust. Whitey's sharp instincts and natural ability to read situations made him useful to others who already had a foothold in these circles. He could be counted on to handle tasks discreetly, and he didn't rattle easily. He also had a knack for making people feel that working with him was in their best interest. This ability to inspire cooperation, sometimes through charm, sometimes through a quiet suggestion, would serve him well in the years to come. Boston's neighborhoods in those days had their own identities, their own invisible borders. Moving between them required a certain skill, especially if you wanted to do business. Whitey developed that skill. He knew when to blend in and when to stand out. He could talk to the dock workers at the harbor, to shop owners on Broadway, or to men running card games in back rooms. In each case, he adapted his tone and demeanor to fit the situation. Even so, Whitey's ties to Southie remained his anchor. The people there knew him as someone who took care of his own. If a neighbor needed a favor, he often found a way to provide it. He didn't forget faces, and he didn't forget those who had helped him. In a place where loyalty was often valued above everything else, this was a powerful trait. By the mid-1950s, Whitey's name was being mentioned more often in conversations among certain groups. He was still relatively young, but he had already built a reputation for being dependable in delicate situations. He didn't act recklessly, and he didn't take unnecessary chances, but when he committed to something, he followed through. During this period, he also began to understand the importance of timing. He noticed that opportunities often came in small windows, and the people who succeeded were those who recognized those moments and acted decisively. This awareness shaped the way he made choices. He was patient when he needed to be, but he could also move quickly when circumstances demanded it. South Boston was a place where people talked, and Whitey knew that managing his image was as important as managing his activities. He didn't boast about what he was doing, but he didn't hide his confidence either. People noticed the way he carried himself, the steady walk, the calm expression, the direct eye contact. Without saying much, he gave the impression that he was someone worth paying attention to. Outside of his own neighborhood, other parts of Boston were experiencing their own changes. New businesses were opening, the economy was shifting, and different groups were competing for influence. Whitey kept an eye on these developments, knowing that understanding the bigger picture could open doors later on. He wasn't in a hurry to take on too much at once. Instead, he was building the kind of foundation that could support bigger moves in the future. His approach was deliberate. Where some young men in his position might have been drawn to flashy displays or quick payoffs, Whitey preferred a slower, more strategic climb. He knew that quick gains often came with quick losses, and he wanted something more lasting. He was willing to let others rush ahead if it meant he could move more securely, with fewer mistakes. Whitey also understood the value of relationships outside of his immediate circle. He maintained contacts in different neighborhoods, in different lines of work, and even in different cities. These relationships didn't always serve an immediate purpose, but he treated them like investments. Over time, many of them would prove valuable in ways that couldn't have been predicted at the start. By the time the 1960s began, Whitey Bulger was no longer just a local figure in Southie. He was becoming a man with reach. He had built a reputation not only for his presence, but for his ability to make things happen quietly, efficiently, and with minimal disruption. People who worked with him often found that things went smoother, that problems got solved without unnecessary drama. For Whitey, this was just the beginning. He was patient, but he was also ambitious. The city was changing, and he intended to be in a position to influence those changes. He wasn't interested in being a small player in a big game. He wanted to help shape the game itself. And as he walked the streets of Southie, greeting familiar faces and noting the details others overlooked, he carried with him a quiet certainty. The foundation he had built was strong. The pieces were in place. The time for bigger moves was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. The 1960s in Boston were a decade of shifts, political changes, cultural waves, and undercurrents of tension between groups that had been quietly competing for years. For Whitey Bulger, these were years when his world became bigger and more complicated. He was no longer the sharp young man keeping mostly to Southie. He was now navigating a broader network of connections, each one adding to his reach and his awareness of how power worked. By now, he had earned a kind of quiet respect in his neighborhood. He was seen as someone who didn't just look out for himself, but also looked out for the people and places that mattered to him. That respect wasn't built on empty talk. It came from years of following through, keeping his word, and handling matters in ways that often left people better off than before they'd crossed paths with him. In a place like South Boston, where people remembered every favor and every slight, this reputation was worth more than money. Still, Whitey knew that if he wanted to move beyond being just a well-regarded figure in Southie, he had to widen his influence. Boston was a city where neighborhoods were like separate worlds, each with its own leaders, loyalties, and rivalries. Moving between them required a skill set few possessed, but Whitey had been preparing for this for years. He didn't force his way in. He learned, he observed, and he found ways to be useful. His sense of timing remained one of his greatest strengths. He had a knack for knowing when to speak up and when to remain silent, when to push for something, and when to let it come to him naturally. That balance allowed him to build relationships in places where outsiders were often met with suspicion. Whether it was a conversation with someone running a local business, a chat with a dock worker down by the harbor, or a quiet meeting with someone from another part of the city, Whitey understood that trust took time, and he was willing to invest that time. It was during this period that his connections began to stretch beyond Boston. Certain people saw in him someone who could handle sensitive situations with precision. Opportunities arose to be involved in ventures that reached into other cities, and while he didn't advertise these moves, those in the know began to recognize his growing influence. This was not the flashy kind of expansion that drew attention. It was deliberate, low-key, and designed to last. Back in Southie, his presence was as steady as ever. He made a point to remain visible, to show that no matter where else his business took him, his loyalty to his home neighborhood hadn't faded. That visibility wasn't just about maintaining ties, it was about sending a message. People knew that Whitey's influence was expanding, but they also knew that his roots were deep. That combination made him a figure to be respected, not just locally, but increasingly across Boston. At the same time, he was taking mental notes about the changing landscape of the city. Boston's politics, law enforcement priorities, and economic pressures were shifting. Whitey had a habit of thinking several steps ahead, and he paid close attention to these changes. He understood that the real key to lasting influence wasn't just reacting to events, it was anticipating them. The 1960s were also a time when alliances mattered more than ever. Whitey was careful in choosing his allies. He didn't form connections just for the sake of numbers. He valued quality over quantity. A smaller circle of reliable, capable people was worth far more to him than a large group whose loyalty might waver under pressure. This approach sometimes puzzled those who thought bigger was always better, but Whitey had no interest in spreading himself too thin. Through it all, his ability to adapt kept him ahead of the curve. He could navigate the traditions of Old South Boston one moment and hold his own in conversations with people from entirely different worlds the next. He wasn't trying to fit into someone else's mold. He was quietly shaping his own, blending the lessons of his neighborhood upbringing with a broader, more strategic outlook. As the decade moved on, Whitey's growing reputation began to take on a life of its own. People he had never met knew of him and had formed opinions based on stories they'd heard. Some saw him as a problem solver, someone who could step into a tough situation and straighten it out. Others saw him as a man to be cautious around. Either way, the fact that people were talking meant that his presence was felt far beyond the streets he had once roamed as a restless kid. In his own mind, though, Whitey knew he was still building. Every step he took, every decision he made, was part of a bigger picture that only he could fully see. He wasn't chasing quick wins. He was assembling the kind of foundation that could withstand pressure from any direction. That meant patience. That meant resisting the temptation to overreach. And it meant always keeping one eye on the horizon, ready for the next shift in the winds. By the end of the 1960s, Boston was not the same city it had been when Whitey started out. But then, Whitey Bulger was not the same man either. The years had sharpened his instincts, broadened his reach, and deepened his understanding of the world he was navigating. And though much lay ahead, opportunities, challenges, and choices that would shape his legacy, he knew one thing for certain: the real game was just beginning. The turn into the 1970s marked a new chapter for Whitey Bulger. By this time, he was no longer just an ambitious figure quietly building his connections. He was someone whose influence in Boston had become difficult to ignore. The streets he had once walked as a young man looking for opportunities were now places where his word carried weight. People listened when he spoke, and not just because of what he had done in the past, but because they knew he could make things happen in the present. South Boston remained his base. He had never let go of his roots, and the neighborhood's loyalty to him was as much about history as it was about the here and now. He knew the rhythms of the place, the way people gathered in the mornings at coffee shops, the unspoken rules about who could park where, the small favors that traveled quietly from one person to another. He had been part of that fabric for so long that he seemed like a permanent fixture. Yet at the same time, his influence extended far beyond those streets. What made Whitey different from others who tried to climb the same ladder was his approach to control. He preferred a kind of quiet authority, one that didn't require constant displays of force or endless meetings to maintain. He understood that true influence wasn't about being everywhere at once. It was about being exactly where you needed to be at exactly the right time. By now, he had a tight-knit circle of trusted people around him. They weren't just assistants or followers. Each one brought something unique to the table, whether it was information, connections, or specialized skills. Whitey knew that surrounding himself with competent, reliable individuals meant he didn't have to micromanage every detail. He could focus on strategy, on seeing the big picture while others handled the smaller moving parts. At the same time, Boston was undergoing changes that played into his hands. The city's development projects, shifting demographics, and evolving political scene created new opportunities for someone who knew how to navigate both the official channels and the quieter, unofficial networks. Whitey had spent years learning how to operate in that space between the visible and the hidden, and now those skills were paying off. It was also in this period that he began to see the value in certain kinds of partnerships that might have seemed unlikely in earlier years. He understood that alliances didn't always have to be permanent to be useful. Sometimes a temporary alignment of interests could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. And when those doors closed again, he would simply step back, ready to move in a different direction when the moment was right. One thing that people often noticed about Whitey was his ability to listen. In a world where many tried to prove themselves by talking the loudest, he often gained more by speaking less. He absorbed details, read between the lines, and stored away bits of information that might not matter immediately but could prove useful later. It was part of what gave him an edge. He was rarely caught off guard because he had already anticipated the possibilities. His presence in the city's social fabric wasn't just about what he could get from others, it was also about what he could offer. For people in South Boston, having someone like Whitey on their side could mean the difference between a problem dragging on for weeks and a solution arriving overnight. That kind of reliability created a deep sense of loyalty, and loyalty was something he valued above almost everything else. As the 1970s unfolded, Whitey's influence began to shift from being purely local to something more structured. While he remained rooted in the streets where he had grown up, he now had the ability to shape events on a much larger scale. He didn't need to announce his role in these developments. People could feel it in the way decisions were made, in the way certain problems simply disappeared, in the way opportunities seemed to open for those connected to him. There was also an understated confidence about him that others found compelling. He didn't need to prove his capability. His track record spoke for itself. When he walked into a room, the conversations might lower in volume for just a moment, not out of fear exactly, but out of a recognition that someone important had arrived. By this stage, Whitey was also more attuned than ever to the shifting balance of power in the city. He could sense when certain players were losing influence and when new ones were emerging. This awareness allowed him to adjust his strategies without making sudden, risky moves. If a door began to close in one area, he had already been working quietly to open another somewhere else. And yet, for all his reach, he maintained an almost understated public profile. He wasn't constantly in the spotlight, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He believed that the less people saw, the less they could understand about the full extent of his operations. The people who mattered, the ones whose cooperation he valued, knew how to find him. By the close of the decade, Whitey Bulger had become more than just a figure of local respect. He was now a central player in a much broader network of relationships and opportunities. The path ahead promised both challenges and rewards, but he had positioned himself so well that he could face whatever came with the same quiet, deliberate confidence that had brought him this far. He had built his foundation carefully, piece by piece, over years of calculated moves. And though the city around him would continue to change, Whitey was certain of one thing. As long as he could adapt faster than the changes themselves, there would always be a place for him at the center of the game. The new decade brought a different energy to Boston. And for Whitey Bulger, the early 1980s were a time when the moves he had been making quietly for years began to bear fruit in ways that were hard for anyone to ignore. By now, his name carried a certain weight in the city. It wasn't the kind of fame you read about in newspapers, at least not often, but within the right circles. It was clear that if something important was happening in certain parts of Boston, there was a good chance Whitey knew about it, or had a hand in it. The foundations he had laid in South Boston continued to serve him well. That neighborhood was still his anchor, the place that had shaped his instincts and sharpened his understanding of people. It was where he could walk into a coffee shop and get nods from half the room without saying a word, where a quiet conversation at the corner table could set in motion something that would ripple far beyond those streets. But Whitey was no longer just a neighborhood figure. Over the years, he had built connections across the city, forming relationships that crossed boundaries others avoided. He was a skilled negotiator, but not in the loud, aggressive way some imagined. His strength came from knowing when to make an offer, when to ask for a favor, and when to simply wait. Patience was a tool he used as often as persuasion. During this period, he became increasingly strategic about his movements. He understood that being seen in certain places at certain times sent a message, sometimes a message only a few people would fully grasp. Whether it was attending a community event, stopping in at a local business, or being spotted in another part of the city entirely, he used his presence as a way to remind people that his influence wasn't confined to one block or one set of streets. He also placed great importance on information. Whitey had a way of gathering it without making it obvious. A casual conversation in a diner could yield a useful detail. A chance meeting on the sidewalk might provide a new perspective on an ongoing situation. Over time, these bits and pieces formed a map in his mind, a map that allowed him to navigate the shifting alliances, rivalries, and opportunities that defined Boston's undercurrent. One of the reasons Whitey had been able to maintain his position for so long was his ability to adapt without losing his core principles. He valued loyalty, consistency, and respect, and he expected the same in return. That didn't mean he was inflexible, rather, it meant he could shift tactics without ever forgetting what he stood for. This balance of adaptability and firmness made him someone people trusted to keep his word, even when the circumstances around them were unpredictable. As his reach grew, so did the complexity of the relationships he managed. He dealt with people from all walks of life, community figures, business owners, individuals with political connections, and those who operated in far more shadowed spaces. Each relationship required a slightly different approach, and Whitey seemed to have an instinct for knowing what would work best in each case. At the same time, he never lost sight of the fact that his position depended on more than just his own decisions. The people around him played critical roles, and he made sure they knew their efforts were valued. He had a knack for making people feel like they were part of something larger, something that mattered. This sense of belonging often proved more powerful than any formal arrangement could. The city itself was changing in ways that presented both challenges and opportunities. New developments were reshaping certain neighborhoods. Long-standing institutions were shifting their priorities. Political winds were blowing in different directions. Whitey kept a close watch on these changes, always considering how they might affect his position and what moves he could make to stay ahead. There were moments when others might have been tempted to overextend, to take on more than they could manage in an attempt to capitalize quickly on a new situation. Whitey avoided that trap. He knew that sudden growth without a solid foundation could be as dangerous as standing still. Instead, he moved steadily, making sure each step forward was supported by the steps he had already taken. The 1980s also brought with them a different kind of attention. While he had always preferred to operate quietly, the scope of his activities inevitably meant that more people knew his name. This visibility required even greater care in how he handled himself. He remained calm under pressure, never letting on when he was thinking several moves ahead. That calmness not only protected him but also reassured those who worked with him. By this time, the network of people who owed him favors or felt a sense of obligation toward him had grown significantly. These were not one-sided relationships. Whitey made sure that when he helped someone, it was in a way that truly benefited them. That mutual exchange strengthened bonds and made it harder for others to break them. Through it all, his focus remained the same: to maintain his position not through fear or force alone, but through respect, trust, and careful planning. He knew that in the world he inhabited, fortunes could shift quickly. One day you might have the upper hand, the next you could be at risk of losing it all. The only way to truly stay in control was to be prepared for whatever came next. By the midpoint of the decade, it was clear to those paying attention that Whitey Bulger was more than just a name whispered in certain corners. He was a force woven into the very fabric of Boston's hidden networks, a man whose decisions could influence events in ways most people never saw coming. And while the years ahead would bring new tests and unexpected turns, he had no intention of letting go of the place he had carved out for himself. For Whitey, this was not the end of the story. It was just the continuation of a carefully built life, one where every move was part of a larger design, one only he could see in full. The mid-1980s in Boston felt different. The streets seemed busier, the skyline taller, the pace of the city quicker. For Whitey Bulger, this wasn't a time to sit back. It was a time to make sure the foundation he had built would hold under the weight of everything he had planned. The years behind him had been spent building influence block by block, relationship by relationship. Now, it was about making sure those connections didn't just hold, but grew stronger in a city that was shifting faster than ever. Whitey understood that the pace of change could be both an advantage and a risk. If you could anticipate it, you could move ahead of it. If you misread it, you could lose ground before you even realized it was happening. He had seen people make the mistake of assuming their position was permanent, only to find out they had been outmaneuvered by someone paying closer attention. He wasn't going to be one of them. South Boston remained the heart of his operations, not just geographically but emotionally. It was the place that shaped his instincts, the neighborhood that still gave him a certain edge. People there knew him, not from headlines or rumors, but from years of small interactions, favors exchanged, and unspoken understandings. He didn't need to explain himself to them. They already knew the kind of man he was and what he valued. But while South Boston was home, his reach extended far beyond it now. He was involved in situations across the city, each one requiring its own careful touch. Sometimes his role was to bring people together, smoothing over tensions that might otherwise boil over. Other times, it was about knowing when to let things play out, when stepping in would cause more problems than it solved. This sense of timing had become one of his greatest strengths. The people closest to Whitey had learned to read him well. They knew when his quiet meant he was simply observing and when it meant he was thinking 3 steps ahead. He didn't waste words, and when he did speak, it was with purpose. Those moments carried weight because people understood he didn't talk just to fill the air. By now, his network was vast but still tightly managed. He didn't believe in spreading himself too thin or working with people he couldn't trust. Every connection had to count. He had a way of making people feel valued, of showing them that their role, no matter how small it might seem, was part of something bigger. That kept them loyal, kept them from looking elsewhere when they needed something done. Boston's political and economic shifts during this time also worked to his advantage. Development projects were transforming certain areas, and with those changes came opportunities. Whitey had a knack for positioning himself where those opportunities would land. He didn't always move directly. Sometimes he would work through others, letting them handle the public side while he stayed just out of view. It wasn't about avoiding attention entirely. It was about controlling the kind of attention he received. Information continued to be his most valuable resource. A conversation overheard at a restaurant, a small detail mentioned in passing. These could be the pieces that helped him make sense of a bigger picture. He stored these details away, sometimes for months, before using them. People often underestimated how much he knew because he never felt the need to show it off. His approach to problem solving also set him apart. When an issue came up, he looked at it from every angle before deciding how to act. He didn't let frustration push him into rash decisions. That patience meant that when he did act, it was with a plan that accounted for possible outcomes. It also meant that his moves tended to stick. He didn't have to go back and fix mistakes because he had already thought them through before making them. The relationships he maintained were as much about trust as they were about results. People knew that if Whitey gave his word, he would keep it. That kind of reputation was rare, and it made him the kind of person others wanted to align with. In a city where loyalties could shift quickly, that stability was a rare and valuable thing. As the decade moved forward, Whitey's influence became something almost invisible to those not directly connected to him. It wasn't about big public displays. It was about the quiet ways he could shape events. A problem that might have dragged on for weeks would simply disappear. A deal that seemed stuck would suddenly move forward. The people who benefited from these changes might not always know how they happened, but they knew enough to be grateful. Even as his influence grew, he kept his world tightly controlled. He knew that too many moving parts could make it harder to see when something was going wrong. By keeping his operations focused and his inner circle close, he reduced the chances of surprises. He also made it clear that loyalty worked both ways. Those who stood by him knew he would stand by them in return. In these years, he also refined his sense of balance between being seen and staying in the background. Sometimes showing up was necessary. It sent a message, reminded people of his presence. Other times, staying away allowed him to work without interference. That balance was something few others could manage as effectively as he did. Through all of this, one thing remained constant. Whitey never let the moment distract him from the bigger picture. He wasn't just thinking about today or next week. He was thinking about the months and years ahead. Every move he made was part of a larger pattern, one designed to keep him exactly where he wanted to be, no matter how the city changed around him. The mid-1980s were a test of that foresight. Boston was shifting in ways that made it clear the future wouldn't look like the past. But Whitey had built his position not on holding on to old ways for their own sake, but on knowing which changes to embrace and which to resist. That ability would keep him ahead in a city where the balance of power was always moving, always changing hands. By the time the decade began to close in on its final years, Whitey's place in Boston wasn't just secure, it was deeply entrenched. And though he knew nothing stayed the same forever, he also knew he had prepared himself for whatever came next. The game was still his to play, and he intended to keep it that way. The late 1980s arrived with a kind of restless energy in Boston. New buildings were going up, old neighborhoods were shifting, and the pace of life seemed to grow a little faster with every passing month. For Whitey Bulger, this was a period that demanded both patience and precision. The city was changing, but so was he. The man who had once been primarily a neighborhood figure now operated on a scale that connected him to people and situations far beyond the streets of South Boston. Yet, in his mind, the rules that had guided him from the start still applied: loyalty, trust, and foresight. South Boston remained his anchor, the place where he was most comfortable and most respected. He could still walk down certain streets and feel the kind of familiarity you only get from growing up somewhere and staying connected to its people. The local shopkeepers greeted him by name. The younger crowd knew his reputation, and those who had known him for decades still treated him like one of their own. That sense of belonging was not just sentimental, it was strategic. People looked out for him because they felt he had always looked out for them. But outside of Southie, his network stretched in directions that weren't visible to the casual observer. Whitey understood that true influence wasn't about being everywhere at once. It was about being connected to the right people in the right places. He had cultivated relationships that allowed him to know what was happening across the city, often before the people directly involved even realized how things would play out. This made him not just a participant in events, but in many cases, a quiet architect of them. His closest associates knew that while he could be personable and even charming in certain settings, there was a side to him that was all calculation. He rarely acted without considering every possible outcome, weighing the risks and rewards with the kind of patience most people couldn't muster. That's why, when he finally made a move, it tended to have lasting effects. During these years, he was particularly careful about maintaining his position without drawing unnecessary attention. Boston was not an easy place to navigate quietly, especially for someone with influence. People talked, rumors spread, and the media was always looking for a story. Whitey's skill was in controlling which stories could be told about him and which would remain untold. Sometimes that meant letting a small rumor circulate because it served a purpose. Other times it meant ensuring that certain conversations never happened at all. The economic developments in Boston during the late 80s opened new doors, and Whitey was quick to see how they could be used to his advantage. Real estate, construction projects, and shifting business interests created a landscape full of opportunities. He didn't chase every single one, that would have been reckless, but he kept a close watch and stepped in when the timing and circumstances aligned. Information remained his most valuable currency. A quiet word from someone in City Hall, a passing remark from a business owner, or even something as small as noticing who attended a community meeting. These pieces of knowledge could be far more valuable than money. Whitey had a talent for storing such details until they could be used to solve a problem or gain an advantage. His relationships were built on a kind of mutual respect. He made sure that when he helped someone, it wasn't just a one-time favor. It was the start of an ongoing connection. Those who worked with him knew that he didn't forget the people who stood by him, and that kind of loyalty was rare enough to keep them from looking elsewhere. It also meant that when Whitey needed something, he didn't have to demand it. People offered it willingly because they knew he would repay the favor in time. Even with his growing influence, he kept his inner circle small. That tight control helped him avoid many of the problems that came from overextending. Too many moving parts could lead to mistakes, and Whitey preferred to keep things manageable. The people who worked closely with him understood the value of discretion and consistency. The political climate in Boston during this period also played a role in shaping Whitey's approach. Shifts in leadership and policy created uncertainty, and he knew that uncertainty often worked in favor of those who could navigate it with confidence. While others scrambled to adjust, Whitey already had plans in motion, ready to adapt to whichever way the wind blew. By now, there was an unspoken understanding in certain circles that crossing Whitey Bulger was simply not worth the trouble. It wasn't just about fear, it was about respect for how he operated. People knew that he kept his word, whether they liked the outcome or not. That reliability made him a rare figure in a world where trust was often fleeting. The late 80s also marked a time when Whitey began to think more seriously about the future. He had been in the game long enough to know that no position was completely secure forever. Staying ahead meant planning not just for the next few months, but for the years ahead. He thought about who would remain by his side, which connections would endure, and how he could ensure that the work he had done would continue to benefit him down the line. In some ways, this period was less about expansion and more about refinement. Whitey didn't need to prove himself. He had already done that. Now it was about making sure every part of his network was strong, every relationship solid, every move calculated for maximum effect. He wasn't in a rush. He knew that in his world, the person who waited for the right moment often came out ahead of the one who tried to force the moment to happen. As the decade edged closer to its end, Boston was on the brink of another wave of change. The 1990s would bring new challenges, new players, and new risks. But standing in the middle of it all, Whitey Bulger was as prepared as anyone could be. He had the history, the connections, and the vision to navigate whatever came next. And for the moment, that was exactly where he wanted to be. The start of the 1990s in Boston brought with it a mixture of old habits and new realities. For Whitey Bulger, it was a time to measure every move carefully. The foundations he had built through the previous decades were still strong, but the city was shifting in ways that required his full attention. A new decade always meant new faces, new ambitions, and new challenges to navigate. He understood that staying where he was required more than simply maintaining what he had. It meant adjusting to the times without losing sight of the principles that had carried him this far. In South Boston, his presence was as steady as ever. People knew him, respected him, and in many ways relied on him. He still had that quality of being part of the neighborhood fabric, not just a figure of influence, but someone who understood the lives of those around him. He listened to their concerns, paid attention to small changes, and never let himself grow distant from the community that had always been his strongest base. Beyond Southie, though, the city's political and economic landscape was changing quickly. There were development projects reshaping entire areas, shifts in city leadership, and new players stepping into the scene. Whitey knew better than to dismiss newcomers. Sometimes the least experienced could cause the biggest ripples simply because they didn't know or didn't care about the unspoken rules. He watched them closely, sizing up which ones could be reasoned with, which ones might be useful, and which ones needed to be kept at a distance. He had learned long ago that influence worked best when it wasn't obvious. Being the loudest or most visible figure in the room wasn't his style. He preferred to be the one quietly steering conversations. the person whose absence was more noticeable than his presence. That approach allowed him to keep working without attracting attention from the wrong places. It also gave him room to maneuver when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. Whitey's network was tighter than ever during this time. He kept close ties with those who had proven themselves over the years, people who had shown they could be counted on no matter the situation. These relationships were built on trust, and trust wasn't something he gave easily. Once you had it, though, it came with the certainty that he would stand by you in return. That loyalty was one of the reasons his circle remained so solid even as the city around them evolved. One of his greatest strengths was the way he handled information. He didn't just gather it, he processed it, compared it with past events, and thought about how it might connect to things still to come. A small detail overheard at a gathering could lead him to make subtle adjustments in his plans. A passing remark from a friend in City Hall might change the timing of a decision. He didn't rush to act on new information. He waited until the moment was right. There were times in these years when tensions bubbled under the surface in certain parts of Boston. Disagreements over territory, misunderstandings between business interests, and personal rivalries could all become problems if left unchecked. Whitey had a way of stepping in at just the right time to calm things down or redirect attention elsewhere. He didn't need to be the one in the spotlight. He just needed the situation to resolve in a way that kept his plans intact. The city itself felt like it was moving faster. More people were coming in, money was flowing in new directions, and technology was starting to change how people communicated and did business. While some resisted these changes, Whitey saw the potential in them. He wasn't quick to jump into something new just because it was new, but he paid attention to how these shifts could eventually serve his interests. His ability to adapt was one of the reasons he remained a step ahead. He didn't cling to old methods for the sake of tradition. If a better, more efficient way presented itself, he considered it. That flexibility meant he could respond to challenges without being trapped by outdated thinking. At the same time, he never abandoned the core strategies that had always worked for him. Keeping a small, trusted inner circle, protecting his sources of information, and maintaining a balance between visibility and distance. During these years, he also became more deliberate about planning for the long term. He knew that staying in his position wasn't just about avoiding mistakes in the moment. It was about making sure the moves he made today would still benefit him years down the line. That kind of forward thinking set him apart from others who were more focused on short-term wins. Whitey's calm, measured approach often gave people the impression that nothing could shake him. In truth, he paid very close attention to the risks around him. He just didn't let those risks control his decisions. If he saw trouble on the horizon, he prepared for it quietly, sometimes making small adjustments that others barely noticed until the moment had passed. That ability to anticipate problems and act before they became crises was one of the keys to his continued success. As the 1990s unfolded, Boston continued to grow and change, and so did the opportunities for someone with Whitey's vision. He was deeply rooted in the city's history, but never so tied to the past that he couldn't see where things were heading. Each day was a mix of old connections and new possibilities, and he moved through it all with the same steady patience that had defined his rise from the beginning. It wasn't about chasing every opportunity. It was about being in the right place, with the right people, at the right time. And for Whitey Bulger, that was something he had mastered long ago. The middle stretch of the 1990s brought a new rhythm to Boston, one that seemed faster and more unpredictable than the years before. For Whitey Bulger, it was a period of both comfort and caution. He had seen enough in his life to know that the calmest waters could hide the strongest currents, and the smoothest paths could lead to unexpected turns. While he still moved with confidence, he also kept a sharper eye on every detail, reading between the lines of conversations and noting the smallest shifts in the air around him. South Boston was still his home ground, the place where his roots were deepest and his instincts the sharpest. The streets there carried a familiarity he could navigate, without thought. He knew which storefronts had been around for decades, which buildings had been sold quietly, and which neighbors could be counted on to share a bit of useful information without realizing how valuable it was. That neighborhood connection was his strength. It kept him grounded while giving him a constant flow of insights others could never access. But Boston was changing in ways that even the most experienced observers found hard to predict. Construction cranes marked the skyline, new businesses opened in once quiet corners, and fresh faces began appearing at city meetings. It wasn't just the physical changes that caught Whitey's attention, it was the way these changes shifted the balance of influence. New opportunities often meant new competition, and while he was never quick to see someone as a rival, he also never underestimated the possibility. He moved through this evolving landscape with the same patience that had always defined his style. He wasn't in a hurry to insert himself into every development or make his presence felt in every conversation. Instead, he watched, listened, and waited for the moments when stepping in would make a difference. This approach kept him from becoming overextended and ensured that when he did act, it carried weight. One of Whitey's quiet skills was his ability to remain informed without appearing to be seeking information. People told him things casually, often not realizing they had given him a small piece of a larger puzzle. A single remark about who had been seen at a certain dinner or which company had unexpectedly withdrawn from a project could give him clues to changes that others hadn't yet noticed. He filed these details away, connecting them when the time was right. By this point, his network was almost self-sustaining. The people who had worked with him for years knew the value of keeping him updated, even if they didn't fully understand why certain bits of news mattered to him. Loyalty was still his strongest currency, and it was repaid in kind. Those who stood by him found that he stood by them, often in ways that were subtle but meaningful. There were occasional moments when friction in the city threatened to boil over. Disagreements between business interests, shifts in political alliances, and the ambitions of newcomers could all stir up tension. Whitey's approach in such situations was rarely direct confrontation. Instead, he found ways to guide events toward a calmer resolution, often by nudging someone toward a decision they might not have reached on their own. His influence was most effective when it didn't feel forced. The mid-90s also brought with them new methods of communication. Mobile phones were becoming more common, and computers were slowly beginning to shape how information moved. Whitey took note of these changes but didn't rush to embrace them. He understood that new tools could be useful, but they also came with risks. For him, the most reliable method of communication was still face-to-face conversation with someone he trusted. His long-term thinking became even more pronounced during this time. He looked not only at the next step in a plan, but at the one after that and the one after that. In his mind, the measure of a good decision wasn't just how it worked today, it was how it would look years later. This perspective gave him a stability that others lacked, especially those who chased immediate gains without considering the future. In public, Whitey's demeanor was calm, almost understated. He didn't need to remind people of his influence. They already knew. That quiet confidence was part of what kept him effective. People often mistook his reserved style for detachment, but in reality, he was absorbing everything, weighing every variable, and thinking several moves ahead. The late afternoons often found him in familiar places, sitting in a corner where he could observe without being the center of attention. He didn't have to say much, just being there allowed him to see who came and went, who spoke with whom, and how certain conversations seemed to ripple outward into the neighborhood. It was a slow, deliberate way of gathering knowledge, but it had served him well for decades. Even as the city's pace quickened and its shape shifted, Whitey retained his sense of timing. He knew when to step forward and when to remain in the background. He understood that sometimes the most powerful position was not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, shaping the events that would later be seen as inevitable. As the decade moved forward, he continued to adapt without losing the essence of what had always worked for him. His relationships were strong, his information steady, and his understanding of the city as sharp as ever. The challenges of the mid-90s didn't rattle him. They simply reminded him that no matter how much things changed, the principles of patience, trust, and foresight remained the same. And for Whitey Bulger, those principles were more than habits. They were the quiet, steady foundation on which his entire life had been built. By the time the late 1990s arrived, the air in Boston seemed heavier, not just with the change of seasons, but with the weight of things unspoken. Whitey Bulger could feel it. He had spent decades reading the pulse of the city, and he knew when something was shifting beneath the surface. It wasn't one single event, not a dramatic turning point, but a gradual accumulation, small signs, slight changes in the way people spoke, in who avoided whose company, in what was no longer being said out loud. In South Boston, he still carried himself with the same quiet certainty. People nodded to him on the street, and those who knew him well greeted him like an old friend. But Whitey was too sharp to mistake familiarity for safety. He noticed when some conversations felt more careful, when someone he trusted hesitated for just a moment before answering a simple question. He kept these observations to himself, but they stayed in his mind, like pins on a map he was slowly charting. He made a habit of walking through familiar places, listening to the tone of the city as much as the words being spoken. There was comfort in those walks, in seeing the old buildings and faces that had been there for years. Yet even in that comfort, there were reminders that time doesn't stand still. A shop window he'd passed 100 times might have a new sign, a corner store might be under new management, or a family he'd known since the early days might quietly move away. He took note of all of it. Outside of the neighborhood, Boston was becoming faster, louder, and more complicated. The growth that had started earlier in the decade was accelerating, bringing in new money, new developments, and new people who didn't always understand the way things had been done for generations. Whitey didn't mind change. He had adapted more than once in his life, but he did mind unpredictability. It was harder to read people who didn't have a history in the city, harder to know which ones would stick around and which would vanish at the first sign of trouble. Information had always been his most valuable resource, and in these years he became even more deliberate about how he gathered it. He preferred in-person conversations, the kind where he could read someone's expression, their posture, the tone behind their words. A phone call or a message could never reveal as much as a face-to-face meeting. He met with people in places where they could talk without being interrupted, sometimes over coffee, sometimes during an evening drive, always keeping the tone casual enough that nothing felt like an interrogation. His network of trusted people remained steady, but even among them he paid attention for subtle shifts. A friend who started showing up late, someone who seemed distracted during a meeting, a longtime associate who started spending more time with unfamiliar faces. These were changes that could mean nothing, or they could mean everything. Whitey didn't jump to conclusions, but he never dismissed the possibility that they were signs of something bigger. The late 90s also brought advances in technology that he couldn't ignore. Mobile phones were smaller, more common, and harder to avoid. Computers were no longer just for businesses. More people had them in their homes. He didn't trust these changes completely. They made communication faster, but they also made it easier for information to end up in the wrong hands. He preferred his old ways, quiet conversations, meetings in places where only the people involved knew what was being said. Boston politics was as intricate as ever, maybe even more so. Alliances shifted without warning, and a decision made in a closed room could ripple outward for months. Whitey understood this game well. He didn't need to be in the room where the decision was made. He just needed to know about it before most others did. Sometimes that meant waiting for a piece of information to come through his usual channels. Other times, it meant being in the right place at the right time to overhear the detail that mattered most. He kept himself visible enough to remain a presence, but not so much that he drew unnecessary attention. There was an art to being known, but not scrutinized, to being respected without being overexposed. It meant showing up at the right gatherings, lending a quiet word of advice to someone who needed it, and knowing when to leave before the conversation turned to subjects that didn't require his voice. As the years closed in on the turn of the century, Whitey spent more time thinking about the future, not just the next week or month, but the years ahead. He had always been forward-thinking, but now there was an added layer of calculation. He wasn't just considering what moves would protect his position. He was thinking about how to secure what he had built in a world that was moving faster than ever. Every decision carried weight. A new partnership, a small investment, even a conversation that might seem harmless. All could have consequences later. He measured each one carefully, sometimes taking days before deciding how to proceed. That patience had always been one of his greatest strengths, and in these times it mattered more than ever. There was no sign of panic in his demeanor, no outward hint that he saw the landscape becoming more complicated. But inside he was sharper, more alert, more deliberate than he had been in years. He knew that the city was changing, and with it, the patterns of trust, influence, and opportunity. The key, as always, was to move with the changes without letting them move him. And so, in the fading light of the decade, Whitey Bulger walked the streets of Boston as he always had, observing, listening, calculating. The city around him might be louder, busier, and less predictable than before, but his approach remained steady. He understood that the game never truly ended. It simply shifted, reshaped by the hands of time. He had survived too many turns in the road to be unsettled by another. As long as he could read the map, even if the streets were new, he believed he would find his way. The first months of the new century came with a feeling in the air that Whitey Bulger could not ignore. Boston, already a city that had gone through countless changes during his lifetime, seemed to be standing at the edge of another transformation. The old ways were still there, but they were being pushed aside, bit by bit, replaced by new systems, new technology, and a new generation of people who didn't always know the city's unwritten rules. For someone like Whitey, who had built his position by reading those rules better than anyone, this was a time that required even more attention to detail. In South Boston, the street still felt familiar under his feet. The rhythm of life there was slower than in other parts of the city, and that gave him room to think. He still took his quiet walks, stopping at places he had known for years, exchanging nods or brief words with people who recognized him. It wasn't just a habit. It was a way to keep his connection to the neighborhood alive. These small interactions mattered. They told him who was still loyal, who had drifted away, and who was paying more attention to him than they should. Conversations had always been his best source of information, but now they seemed more cautious. People were more aware of being overheard, of how quickly something said in passing could travel. Mobile phones were in almost everyone's pockets, and the presence of new technology meant that even casual remarks could be recorded or shared without warning. Whitey didn't trust it. For him, the safest words were the ones spoken in a quiet corner, face to face, where the tone and look in someone's eyes could tell him more than the words themselves. The early 2000s also brought more movement into Boston from the outside. People were arriving for work, for school, for business opportunities. They brought money, ideas, and energy, but they also brought unpredictability. Some didn't know or care about the networks that had kept certain parts of the city running smoothly for decades. Others were eager to make their own mark, even if it meant stepping into spaces they didn't understand. Whitey noticed this shift and filed it away as something to watch closely. In his world, the balance of influence was always delicate. He had maintained it for years through patience, timing, and a deep understanding of the personalities involved. Now, he found himself dealing with new names, new faces, and a growing sense that the old lines between friend and stranger were harder to see. This made him more selective in who he spoke with and how much he revealed. Trust had always been valuable, but now it felt like a rare currency. Despite these changes, he maintained a certain calm. On the surface, nothing about him seemed hurried or unsettled. He still appeared in the right places at the right times, still listened more than he spoke, and still gave the impression of someone who had all the time in the world. But behind that calm, he was paying closer attention than ever. Every meeting, every passing remark, every shift in the tone of a familiar voice, these were the things he measured and stored away. The city's political climate continued to change as well. Decisions were being influenced by people outside the traditional circles, and alliances formed faster than they used to. Whitey had always been able to predict where a decision might land based on who was in the room. But now, the rooms were bigger, and the connections less obvious. It wasn't impossible to follow. It just took more effort, more listening, and more patience. Even with these challenges, Whitey's network remained one of his strongest assets. The people who had been with him for years still respected the role he played, and many still came to him quietly for advice. These conversations often gave him early warning of changes before they became public. A whisper about a development project, a quiet complaint about a business deal gone wrong, or even a mention of a new name entering the neighborhood could give him days or weeks of advance notice before others caught on. He adapted his movements to fit the times. Instead of long public gatherings, he preferred smaller, quieter meetings. Instead of lingering too long in any one place, he kept his schedule unpredictable. This kept him from becoming an easy target for attention, and it meant that those who wanted to find him often had to go through someone else first. That layer of separation was deliberate. It gave him control over who could reach him and when. There were still moments of ease, times when the day was just about familiar faces and familiar streets. But even in those moments, his mind was working. He was always considering what was next, what small move could position him better, what relationship might need a little more attention. Years of experience had taught him that stability was never permanent. It was something you had to maintain through constant, careful effort. By the middle of the decade, Whitey could see the direction the city was heading. It would be faster, more connected, more transparent in some ways, but also more complicated. People would rely less on personal relationships and more on systems and networks he couldn't fully control. He didn't fear this change, but he respected it. It meant he would need to be even more deliberate about how he worked, and even more careful about who he worked with. Still, he carried himself as if nothing had changed at all. That was part of his strength, never showing more than he wanted people to see. Those who met him in those years would often describe him as steady, unshakable, and always in control. They didn't see the constant calculation happening behind the calm exterior, the way every conversation and observation was weighed and filed for future use. As the decade moved forward, he remained where he had always been, somewhere between the center of the city's flow and the quiet corners where real decisions were made. The streets might change, the buildings might be replaced, and the faces might grow younger. But Whitey Bulger still moved with the same deliberate pace, reading the city like a familiar book, even as new chapters were being written. And though the world around him was shifting in ways that would challenge anyone, he still believed that patience, timing, and the careful use of information would keep him exactly where he needed to be. The passing of time was something Whitey Bulger had learned to respect early in life. It didn't matter how steady things seemed on the surface. Time moved everything forward, changing people, changing places, changing the very rules that once felt permanent. By the mid-2000s, that truth was as clear to him as ever. Boston was still the city he knew, but it was wrapped in a different skin now. New faces were taking the places of the old. New buildings were cutting into familiar skylines, and the quiet, tightly woven connections that had held certain neighborhoods together were starting to loosen. Whitey noticed the little things first. Streets where you could once walk for a block and recognize nearly every face now had people who carried themselves differently, who didn't carry the history of the place in their eyes. Corner stores that had been there for decades were gone, replaced by shops with brighter lights and unfamiliar names. Even the rhythm of conversations had shifted. People talked faster, checked their phones more often, and seemed to keep one eye on the clock. It wasn't bad, just different. But difference mattered to him because it signaled change. He didn't speak about these observations much. Instead, he kept them tucked away, letting them settle until he could see a clear pattern. It was a habit he'd developed long ago. Never react too quickly, never assume the first sign of change is the whole story. Patience, in his mind, was still the most valuable tool he had. His way of moving through the city hadn't changed, though. He still preferred face-to-face meetings over phone calls, still chose the corners of coffee shops where he could see the door, still walked familiar streets in the late afternoon when the light began to fade. These were more than habits. They were ways of staying connected, both to the people he trusted and to the city itself. A quick conversation on a sidewalk could tell him more than hours of reading the news. Information flowed differently now. In earlier years, news traveled through word of mouth, each retelling shaped by the person passing it along. Now, it could appear instantly on a screen, reaching hundreds or thousands of people in the time it once took to finish a cup of coffee. This meant the kind of information Whitey valued most. The quiet, useful kind was harder to find. You had to dig for it, to know exactly where to look and who might still be willing to share it without broadcasting it to the world. Whitey understood that trust was a slower process now. In a city where conversations could be recorded without anyone noticing, where a stray photo could be shared in seconds, people guarded their words more carefully. He adapted by making his own meetings smaller, more deliberate. He didn't invite everyone into every conversation. Instead, he chose each participant with care, knowing that even among old acquaintances, not everyone needed to know everything. Despite the shift in pace, there were still constants in his life. He kept certain routines, certain small rituals that grounded him. There was a diner where the coffee was never great but always hot, where the same waitress worked the morning shift and remembered how he liked his eggs. There was a bench in a quiet park where he could sit for a few minutes in the middle of the day, watching the steady movement of people and traffic. These familiar points gave him something solid to hold on to, a reminder that even as the city evolved, some pieces remained untouched. The larger Boston landscape, however, was buzzing with new ambition. Development projects were pushing into places that had once been overlooked, bringing in people and businesses from far away. This brought opportunity for some and frustration for others. Whitey listened closely to both sides. The ones who felt left out had stories worth hearing, and the ones driving the change often revealed more than they meant to when they talked about their plans. In this climate, timing became even more critical. Acting too soon could draw unnecessary attention. Waiting too long could mean missing a moment altogether. Whitey's instinct for timing had always been one of his strengths, and he trusted it more than ever now. He would let situations develop, watching for the right opening before making a move. Sometimes that meant letting others rush in first, learning from their successes or mistakes before deciding his own approach. The city's political environment mirrored its physical changes. There were new players in positions of influence, some with connections that extended far beyond Boston. Old alliances still existed, but they had to share space with fresh networks that operated under different rules. Whitey didn't dismiss these newcomers. He simply studied them. He wanted to know who they listened to, what they valued, and how they made their decisions. The relationships he had built over decades still mattered, but he knew they couldn't carry him forever without careful maintenance. He made time for quiet conversations with old friends, checking in without always having a specific reason. These moments kept bonds alive, reminded people of shared history, and ensured that if he needed information or a favor, the lines of communication were still open. In public, he maintained the same steady presence he always had. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't try to be everywhere at once. He appeared just enough to remind people he was still around, still paying attention, still a part of the city's quiet current. Those who knew him understood that if he showed up somewhere, it was for a reason, even if that reason wasn't obvious. As the years moved deeper into the decade, he thought more often about the future. He didn't dwell on the past. He had lived too long to get caught in nostalgia. But he understood that every decision now would shape what came next. The challenge wasn't in holding on to the past. It was in carrying forward the principles that had always worked for him, even in a city that was changing faster than ever. Through it all, Whitey remained deliberate. He moved when it made sense, waited when it didn't, and trusted his ability to read the small signs others missed. The city could grow, stretch, and shift around him, but as long as he could see the patterns forming, he believed he would always find his place within them. And so, day after day, he walked those streets with the same calm pace, keeping the same watchful eyes, carrying the same quiet certainty that had guided him through every era of his life. Whatever came next, he was ready to meet it, just as he always had, on his terms. The turn of another year came without ceremony for Whitey Bulger. In his world, Dates on a calendar were far less important than the steady flow of events and the way people reacted to them. Boston was deep into its transformation now, and every corner of the city seemed to hum with a new kind of energy. The skyline was growing taller, the streets more crowded, and the neighborhoods were shifting in character faster than anyone could have imagined a decade earlier. For Whitey, these changes were more than scenery. They were signals. Each new construction project, each business opening or closing, each wave of people moving into or out of an area told him something about where the city was heading. He knew how to read those signals the way other people read maps. A high-end apartment building going up on a quiet block meant more than just new neighbors. It meant a different kind of commerce, different priorities, different conversations at the corner store. The way people interacted with the city was different too. In earlier days, you could walk into certain spots and know exactly who you would see there, know the flow of the room before you even stepped inside. Now, it was unpredictable. The regulars were mixed in with strangers, and the strangers came and went without much interest in learning the unspoken rhythms of the place. Whitey understood that this lack of familiarity changed how information moved. It was harder to trace, harder to predict. He adjusted by broadening the way he listened. It was no longer enough to talk only to the people who had been in his circle for years. He started paying closer attention to the newcomers, not because he trusted them, but because they often spoke freely without realizing who might be listening. A casual remark in a coffee shop or a careless comment on the street could still reveal something useful, but you had to be ready to hear it. The city's pulse had quickened. Deals were made faster, opportunities appeared and vanished in a matter of days, and people were more willing to take risks, sometimes without thinking through the consequences. Whitey watched all of this from his steady vantage point, never rushing to match the pace. His patience made him stand out even more now. In a world that seemed to be moving at double speed, he remained deliberate. He was still selective about where he spent his time. A meeting in a quiet back booth of an old diner might be worth more to him than an evening in a crowded bar where voices overlapped and the noise never settled. He liked places where people talked in low tones, where the hum of the room made it easy to speak without being overheard. These choices weren't just about comfort, they were about control. The fewer variables in a setting, the easier it was for him to focus on what mattered. Whitey also saw the shift in how loyalty worked. In the past, loyalty had been built over years, tested in small ways until it was solid. Now it seemed more temporary, tied to convenience rather than history. People moved between groups faster, following opportunity wherever it appeared. He didn't resent this. He simply adapted by keeping his expectations realistic. If someone stayed loyal for a long time, it was a bonus, but he no longer counted on it as a given. Information had always been his currency, but now it required more work to gather. The old network of quiet informants still existed, but their reach was smaller. To fill the gaps, Whitey relied on observation. He had a gift for noticing the small details others missed. The way someone's tone shifted when they spoke about a certain topic. The way certain names kept coming up in different conversations. These fragments, when pieced together, gave him a clearer picture than any single conversation ever could. He made a habit of walking the city at different times of day. The early morning walks showed him the city waking up, delivery trucks unloading, shopkeepers opening doors, the quiet before the full rush of the day. Late-night walks were different. They revealed the quieter, more hidden movements, the small transactions that took place when most people weren't looking. Both perspectives were important, and both fed into his understanding of the city's shifting shape. The mid-2000s brought a kind of restlessness to Boston. The old guard and the new arrivals often brushed against each other, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. Whitey didn't take sides in those clashes. He simply noted how they unfolded. Each tension point was an opportunity for someone to step in and influence the outcome, and he was careful about when and how he might do that. He also became more intentional about his own visibility. Too much presence could invite attention he didn't want, but too little could make people forget he was there. He struck a balance, appearing at certain community events, showing up in places where his presence would be noticed but not questioned, and always leaving before the mood of the room could shift in an unpredictable direction. Whitey's approach to conversations was as sharp as ever. He let others do most of the talking, offering only enough words to keep them comfortable. This had a way of making people reveal more than they planned. Silence, he knew, was a powerful tool. It encouraged others to fill the gap, and in doing so, they often gave him exactly the information he needed. Through it all, he kept his sense of perspective. He understood that no city, no matter how fast it changed, could completely erase the deeper patterns that shaped it. People still sought connection, still formed alliances, still made decisions based on trust, fear, or ambition. Those fundamentals didn't change. They just looked different on the surface. By the time the decade edged toward its close, Whitey could see the outlines of Boston's next chapter forming. It would be faster, more outward-facing, more connected to the wider world. For someone like him, that meant the quiet spaces would be harder to find, and the private conversations fewer. But he had adapted before, and he would adapt again. He moved through the city with the same measured pace he always had, eyes open, ears tuned to the small notes in the city's soundtrack that others didn't hear. Change was constant, but so was his ability to find his place within it. The streets might belong to a new generation now, but Whitey knew them in a way they never would. That knowledge was its own kind of power, and as long as he held on to it, he felt no rush, no panic, only the steady certainty that he could navigate whatever came next. The colder months had settled in, wrapping the city in a damp chill that seemed to seep into every crack in the pavement and every brick wall. Boston always felt a little smaller in the winter. The streets were less crowded, the usual noise softened by snow, and the wind off the harbor carried a bite that encouraged people to keep their heads down and move quickly. For Whitey Bulger, winter was a season of observation. When people hurried, they tended to be less guarded, more focused on reaching their destination than on who might be watching. The city's pace was slower in some ways, but it also felt more revealing. Without the bustle of summer events or the distractions of warm weather, the patterns of daily life were easier to spot. The same figures appeared in the same places day after day, giving away their routines without meaning to. Whitey knew how to read those patterns, how to tell the difference between someone simply keeping warm in a corner diner and someone quietly meeting the same face at the same table every week. He made it a point to blend into the season's rhythm. He favored heavy coats with deep pockets, hats pulled low, and routes that allowed him to pass through the city without drawing attention. There was something about the way winter muted the colors and sounds of Boston that suited him. It gave him space to move without being noticed and time to think without interruption. The city was still in flux, still evolving. Even in the middle of winter, construction cranes cut against the skyline, and the sounds of progress, hammering engines, shouts, carried through the cold air. Whitey noticed how certain areas, once quiet and overlooked, now buzzed with new energy. He kept mental notes of these changes, knowing that where money flowed, influence followed, and where influence settled, opportunities could be found. In his quiet way, he kept connections alive. He stopped into familiar spots just often enough to be remembered, but not so often as to become predictable. Conversations were short, sometimes only a few sentences, but enough to exchange a small piece of news or an observation. Whitey never asked direct questions unless he was sure of the answer beforehand. Instead, he let people speak about what they wanted, guiding the flow without seeming to. The older faces in his circle appreciated his consistency. While the city grew louder and faster around them, Whitey kept the same deliberate pace, the same calm voice, the same ability to listen without judgment. These qualities built trust, and trust even now was more valuable than any other resource. In an environment where alliances shifted quickly, he remained a steady point, and that made people more likely to share with him what they wouldn't share with others. Still, he was careful. The newer faces in the city didn't carry the same understanding of boundaries. They were more likely to speak too openly, to rely on technology for conversations that shouldn't be recorded. to underestimate how far and how fast a piece of information could travel. Whitey treated these individuals with polite distance. He didn't dismiss them. Sometimes their carelessness could be useful, but he never relied on them for anything important. Winter nights were his favorite time to walk. The streets were quieter, the glow from street lights casting long shadows across the snow. He would choose a route that took him past old landmarks, places that had stood through decades of change, and newer buildings that hinted at where the city was going next. Each block told a story, and he knew how to listen to it. Whitey also recognized that in the quieter months, certain deals were struck more discreetly. Without the cover of summer crowds, people met in different ways, often in places they wouldn't visit in warmer weather. A dimly lit bar that might be overlooked in July could become a hub of conversation in January. He noticed these shifts, storing the knowledge for when it might be useful later. The weather had a way of bringing people together indoors, and indoors was where Whitey excelled. A slow afternoon in a coffee shop could be as valuable as any planned meeting. He would sit with his back to the wall, watching the door, and listen to the ebb and flow of conversation around him. Even without catching every word, he could learn plenty from the way people interacted, their tone, their body language, the faces they lit up for and the ones they avoided. Boston in winter demanded patience, and patience was something Whitey had in abundance. While others grew restless with the short days and long nights, he used the time to refine his understanding of the city's new balance. Change didn't pause for the season. It just moved at a different pace, and he was there to follow it. He thought often about how the city seemed to be in a constant cycle, old ways fading, new ones taking root, only for the new to become old again in time. That cycle was as dependable as the tides, and Whitey knew that his role was not to fight it, but to navigate it with care. As long as he kept his footing, he could move between those shifting currents without being pulled under. By the time the snow began to melt, he had a clearer sense of what the coming year would bring. The developments he'd been watching were moving into their next phase. New names were beginning to appear in conversations, and certain alliances were starting to form quietly beneath the surface. He didn't rush to act on any of it. Instead, he let the city thaw, knowing that spring would bring its own opportunities and its own risks. For now, he was content to keep walking those winter streets, gathering what the season had to offer, and holding it all in reserve for the moment when it would matter most. The city would keep changing, as it always did. But Whitey had no intention of being left behind. He had walked too many miles through too many winters to believe otherwise. By the time spring began to settle over Boston, the streets felt alive again in a way they hadn't for months. Sidewalks filled with people shaking off the weight of winter, restaurants put tables outside, and music floated from open doorways. For most, it was a welcome change, a signal to slow down, linger, and enjoy the softer weather. For Whitey Bulger, it was simply another shift in the city's rhythm, one he had been expecting and quietly preparing for. With warmer days came movement, more faces in the streets, more conversations in public, and more opportunities to blend in without effort. Whitey used the bustle as cover. Where winter had allowed him to notice patterns through absence and stillness, spring offered a different kind of information. People were less guarded in good weather, willing to talk longer, to share a little more, and sometimes to forget who might be listening nearby. He moved with the crowds when it suited him, but never became part of them. He knew which corners allowed for the best view without being obvious, which spots near the harbor let the wind carry away the sound of a private conversation, and which narrow streets created natural choke points where people slowed down just enough for him to catch a snippet of something useful. The city was still shifting beneath the surface. New developments were rising faster now, some nearly finished, others just breaking ground. Whitey noticed how these projects were changing not just the skyline, but the flow of the neighborhoods themselves. Old gathering places were closing, replaced by glossy new storefronts. People who had been part of the same block for years were moving out, their places taken by those with different routines, different connections. He kept track of these transitions the way others might keep track of a sports season, watching the roster change, noting who was new to the game and paying attention to who was quietly leaving without a word. Each name, each movement, told him something about the direction Boston was heading. Even as the city's look and feel evolved, Whitey's habits stayed steady. He was still deliberate about where he went and when. He preferred to arrive somewhere when it was neither too crowded nor too empty, slipping in at the point when attention was elsewhere. He spoke in the same measured way, listened more than he talked, and kept his questions light enough that no one noticed how much he was really learning. In spring, the city's energy seemed to pull people into each other's orbit more often. There were more community events, more casual gatherings, more reasons for people to cross paths. Whitey saw these moments for what they were. Not just social occasions, but chances to observe alliances forming, tensions rising, and undercurrents shifting. He didn't interfere. He rarely needed to. Just watching was enough to understand where things were heading. Some faces from the past reappeared as the weather improved. Old acquaintances who had kept to themselves during the cold months now surfaced, bringing news, small favors, or simply the kind of conversation that kept ties alive. Whitey welcomed them with the same calm demeanor, never pressing too hard, but making it clear he was still listening, still present. The harbor became one of his favorite places in these months. The air carried the mixed scent of salt and fuel, the water reflected the changing sky, and the steady movement of ships in and out of the docks gave the impression of constant transition. He liked to watch from a distance, imagining where each vessel had been and where it was going. In his mind, the city worked much the same way. People came and went, carrying their own cargo of stories, deals, and connections, each one adding to the bigger picture. Spring also brought with it a certain unpredictability. Just as the weather could shift from sunshine to rain in